Greetings and welcome to the final session of One Planet, One Health, One Future, moving forward in a post-COVID-19 world. This final session is on the importance of multilateralism and trans-sectoral partnerships for One Health and global health security. My name is Susan Lieberman. I'm Vice President for International Policy with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I will moderate this last session. If you are just joining us, you can post questions in the chat and we will do our best to relay those. Others will do their best to relay the questions to me. With 600 people registered for this entire conference, I apologize in advance. We can't get to all your questions, but we have heard excellent presentations on the context of preventing the next pandemic and One Health in a Latin American context, and this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are, in an African context and in an Asian context. But in this session, we're going to be talking about the multilateral context. And no one country or group or discipline or sector holds enough knowledge and resources to single-handedly prevent the emergence or spread of the next pandemic. So we must work together in a multilateral context, in a cooperative context, and we will hear about that from our four outstanding speakers today. I just want to make a point and put this a little bit in a historical context. 75 years ago last month, the world began the recovery from the devastation of World War II and established the UN in order to maintain international peace and security. The world's population then was about 2.5 billion, and the globalization and environmental destruction we see today were not even envisaged. Today, we have more than 7.8 billion people in an interconnected world that could not have been imagined in 1945. So as we begin the recovery from the devastation of COVID-19, we need a new paradigm. We have to come together with the same energy that the world did post-1945 in a true global, integrated, multilateral approach to One Health and preventing the next pandemic that involves human health, animal health, and biodiversity in a truly interconnected way. And we'll now hear from four outstanding speakers on the importance of multilateralism and partnerships across all sectors. The first panelist that I'm very honored to introduce is Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. Has a very long bio that I will not take away from his talk to read, but he is currently the CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility, and previously was the Minister of the Environment and Energy for Costa Rica, but I will not read his entire long bio now. You can find it on many websites. Carlos Manuel, the floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Buenos dias. Greetings from Costa Rica. Thank you, Susan. Delighted to be able to talk today and be able to share the panel with our colleagues and friends. And you know, the topic, being able to address this topic in this moment is key, because at this very precise moment, a lot of governments are taking decisions on ways forwards on how to deal, not just with the health pandemic related issue, but most importantly with the social and human impact of the pandemic. And even though we all understand in a very broad manner that this pandemic is the byproduct of this dysfunctional, broken relationship with humans and nature, as we see the decisions that are being taken at the Congress level, executive branches in different countries, that is not properly being clearly reflected. And this is where we need to really concentrate and understand how the multilateralism can support countries to address the very short-term issues with the need to support them in ways by which we can all work together in a new development paradigm. And this sounds like easy, but it's extremely complex. Probably 40% of developing countries, particularly less developed countries, are having a huge financial and fiscal crisis. This means that they will need to access resources through debt, and they will get into a vicious circle of not being able to comply with their financial obligations, and debt is going to become a major issue as they are being confronted with the social and political realities. A lot of political unrest in many countries are happening, and yes, of course, a lot of social unrest. So many countries tend to believe that the way forward are short-term magical solutions. And I fear that those short-term magical solutions will basically bring us again where we were before the pandemic, in an economic system that aims for growth, unlimited growth, without recognizing planetary boundaries, supported in an innate economic system that is totally linear, take, make, and waste, and basically sustained by extractive industries of oil and gas. And this is happening. All countries, even countries like Costa Rica, my own country, who has invested so much on a green economic trajectory, Congress is thinking on once more on open pit mining, oil and gas, which were things that we settled, politically speaking, 20 years ago. So we need to be able to really understand those threats associated to the fact that the fiscal crisis will means that many agencies, public agencies, will be dealing with budget cuts. And the first ones that are going to be affected with budget cuts are going to be the ministries of environment, ministries of culture, because traditionally these are politically perceived as two sectors that doesn't produce or generate wealth or progress. And once more, there are 8 countries in Latin America where where the ministries of environment will be having major budget cuts. If we associate this with the fact that many financial related incomes, because related to tourism, has on the other side of the line been affected, we had a perfect storm. So here's where multilateralism needs to kick in and be able to provide provide guidance in terms of how do we address the very short-term needs of reactivizing the economy, generating jobs as we move away from this fossil fuel-based economic system. And yes, particularly multilateral financial organization has a big responsibility, and they are stepping into the process. And I tend to believe that it's not just doing a green supporting program. I think that we need, Susan, more than that. I remember in the 1990s where many multilateral agencies were helping countries to their structural adjustment plans to prepare their economies for competitiveness, globalization, free trade, open markets. Well, this is the right moment to do something similar on the green angle. We need major green adjustment structural plans coming from the multilateral development agencies and financial institutions that can help us do the leap forward into a greener system of consumption and production. And this is kind of the main challenge. I'm really delighted to see IMF working with countries in understanding how can they work together, whereby the IMF is telling them, yeah, we will be supporting you all, but you shouldn't go away from your Paris Agreement commitment, your NDCs, and you should continue with your plans to decarbonize your economies. So in this context, the GF as a multilateral agent and its partners are considering investments that follows the following principles. One, we need to work to decrease or eliminate subsidies that are harmful to One Earth. Biodiversity and climate change are key sectors that are being extremely affected by subsidies and economic policies. We need to work with stakeholders to propose expansion of new taxation policies for environmental and climate harms. The same way we need to help ensure that the COVID recovery funds support biodiversity, climate, and the principles of One Earth outcomes. We need to engage and support the private sector investment in clean infrastructure, green infrastructure, and natural capital, and the list of things are long. And the GF is working on a white paper. The WCS has been extremely supportive of this initiative, and the end of the JEF7 cycle and the incoming JEF8 cycle will bring all of these elements into the core of our investment, because we tend to believe that the GF is a partner of choice for that green recovery. Now, my final point here, Susan, with the organizations that work at the national, bilateral, multilateral level on sustainability, we work in, I will use football terms, in the second division. We need to understand that COVID-19 is our opportunity to go from the second division to the Premier League. We need to be playing in the Premier League. What is the Premier League? The Premier League is where the G20 countries, the head of multilateral organizations, private sector, financial institutions, the business sectors gather around and mobilize resources at a large scale for human development. There are quite a few huge funds that are being replenished constantly, and there are big political negotiations around that. And even though climate change and nature conservation is a sensitive issue for those players in the Premier League, we don't play in that Premier League. This is the moment that we really need to understand what is the data, what is the political narrative, so we can do the jump from the second division, where we've been here for 50 years, into the Premier League. This is an aspiration that I do have personally in bringing the GF and the other multilateral environmental funds to be able to add value to that Premier League in terms of human development. Because if we see what we have done in the last 30 years in human development, we've been extremely successful before the pandemic, because all human development indicators progress and increase dramatically in every single country of the world. Unfortunately, we did that by losing forests, by polluting the rivers, by putting more carbon in the atmosphere, and yes, we are in track of having more plastic than fish in the ocean. So if we don't go from our second division, where we do great things in the very small scale, into the Premier League, we may lose a huge opportunity. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And even with my limited understanding of sports, I do know what it means to move biodiversity into the Premier League. So let's take that forward. Thank you very much. We'll have time for questions afterwards, but I'd now like to turn it over to Mr. Stéphane Pailler, head of the Climate and Environment Directorate in the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs with the Government of France. Mr. Pailler, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you for your invitation. So the pandemic crisis has not only confirmed the collective diagnosis of the importance of international cooperation, it also recalled that effective multilateralism has to be reactive. In his speech at the Paris Peace Forum, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Le Drian, explained to us that multilateralism is not a dogma, it's not an ideology, this is an effective method, and a method that works. Indeed, without multilateralism, there would be no Paris Agreement, no global fund to save human lives by fighting AIDS or malaria or tuberculosis, and the list goes on. There is an urgent need to reinvent multilateralism. This does not mean that we should abandon its historic fora. On the contrary, we should reinforce them. We can create and promote a new methodology associating state and international organizations, but also local authorities, NGOs, and private companies. We have implemented this methodology in the Paris Peace Forum. The third edition has just ended. Last year, during the previous edition of the forum, Heiko Maas, the German Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, launched an alliance for multilateralism about a triple ambition. First, compensate the insufficient commitment of states. Second, to reform and modernize institutions, because the United Nations can be improved. And third point, we have to adapt our multilateral tools to contemporary challenges. This year, on November 12, at the third Paris Peace Forum, France and Germany launched and announced the creation of a One Health High-Level Expert Council. The heads of WHO, OIE, FAO, and UNEP agreed to reinforce their work together, building upon the existing FAO, OIE, and WHO tripartite cooperation in order to address risks at the human-animal environment interface and have a joint secretariat. To do so, they agreed to create a council involving all 4 agencies and other key international experts on human, animal, environment, and social sciences. So the I Council will bring together all the actors necessary to understand and help manage emerging health issues. Scientists from all disciplines and from all sectors will be involved in that process. So it's a very important council with a multi and interdisciplinary and intersectoral approach. The council will provide recommendations integrating the characteristics of the different health sectors at the international level. Based on these recommendations, states and international organizations will be able to put in place measures and operation in order to better anticipate, to better monitor and act early and react to a world emergency situation. They will be able to build and promote social ecosystem that make it possible to avoid or limit emergencies. The expert council should also support national, regional, and international health policies, supporting WHO, OIE, FAO, UNEP, as well as states. Finally, to ensure strong support for the most vulnerable countries, it will have to help these actors to put in place research and health management applicable to all countries and the regions. It will be necessary to take into account the specificity of these territories within a framework of equity and international cooperation. While the population of the South may be highly resilient due to their history and to their environment, the ecosystems in which they operate remain among the most fragile due to overexploitation of natural resources, especially for export. In addition, and it will be my final point, the environmental component, which until now had little presence on issues of integrated approach to health, will be reinforced with the participation of UNEP in this tripartite One Health WHO OIE FAO alliance. More broadly, France wishes to reinforce multilateralism and cross-sector partnerships. In his speech at the UNGA of September 22, President Macron committed to protecting ecosystems in view of the decisive deadlines that the climate, biodiversity, and combating desertification COPs will be for the United Nations, and proposed that the summit be organized next year in New York ahead of the 3 COPs. So it will give them a decisive boost and achieve tangible results. The approach promoted by One Health will, of course, have to occupy a central place in the world, in this world of shared challenges that is ours. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Pailler. There was a lot to take in, fantastic. And this new One Health Council is very encouraging, and particularly your point that we can't talk about One Health and preventing the next pandemic if we leave out the environment and think of the environment as well as an afterthought. Let's think about biodiversity. We are experiencing this pandemic now because biodiversity was too much of an afterthought. So that's very encouraging. Also encouraging to hear of not only the support for multilateralism, but the role of science. Absolutely. I now would like to turn it over and to hear from Ms. Mette Wilkie, who's the director of the Forestry Division of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. In the interest of time, I will also not read her impressive bio, but we look forward to hearing from you, and the floor is yours, Ms. Wilkie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon to evening to everybody who's here. It's a delight to be after two very distinguished speakers, and I can only say that I fully and wholeheartedly agree with what they've said. We do need to tackle the current crisis and to the recovery after COVID-19 to take into account biodiversity crisis, the climate change crisis, and the economic crisis at the same time. And we can do that. And we clearly also need to work together on a One Health approach. So I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon and to tell you a little bit about a program that does just that. I'm speaking here on behalf of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, but also our three partners, the Center for International Forestry Research, C4, the French Agricultural Research Center for International Development, CIRAD, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS. And I want to talk to you about a specific project that's trying to bring all of this to bear on the ground. It is a program that was launched in 2017. It's called the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program. Some people call it by the acronym SWM or SWIM, but I want to talk to you a little bit about it. It's a very ambitious 7-year initiative of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. And it's supported by the European Union with a budget of 45 million euros, working in 13 countries across the world. They have, among many other things, just been looking at the aspects related to COVID-19 and have produced a white paper and a policy brief entitled Build Back Better in a Post-COVID-19 World, Reducing Future Wildlife-Borne Spillover of Disease to Humans. These two publications target development partners, policymakers, and they provide informed recommendations for priority actions and investments. We all know that almost all the recent epidemics have originated in animals and in particularly in wildlife. We also know from past experience and from recent assessments of the impact of COVID-19 that wild resources, including wild meat, fish, non-timber forest products, are used as a coping strategy by rural households. And this trend is likely to increase if the current crisis continues. And if we take those two together, they underline a key message of those two publications, which is that the need to strengthen and implement a One Health approach, where, as you've heard, environmental health, animal health, and human health are integrated on one hand, and the need to build resilience through the sustainable management of wildlife and the promotion of locally produced and diversified food sources are equally important, and they are interconnected. And these papers recommend sort of 3 essential steps if we look at how we want to prevent the next zoonotic pandemic. Firstly, we need to minimize the risk of disease spillover from animals to people. Secondly, we need to ensure early detection and reporting of zoonotic diseases and their outbreaks. And thirdly, we need to make sure we have a rapid and effective public health response to halt the spread of the disease. This is all very logical, but let me explain a little bit about how this program works closely with partner organizations and governments to implement key activities that address at least the first two of those needs on the ground. In order to prevent further outbreaks, the program is working to increase the rights to land tenure and natural resource use of indigenous peoples and local communities, and to support their efforts to prevent the degradation, fragmentation of the natural environments, particularly the forest, and to restore the integrity of ecosystems that have already been degraded. Through these actions, natural habitats are better conserved and restored, and that would help reduce the human-wildlife interface, which often happens at the interfaces between forest and agriculture, for example. The program is also testing what we call targeted social marketing to try and induce behavioral change, to limit the urban consumption of wild-caught animals. Since this is not necessity, it's not a dietary necessity for families in large metropolitan areas that are located far from the sources of wildlife. This would help both reduce the illegal wildlife trade that we know is happening, but also the risk that the next zoonotic disease spillover will happen within urban markets that are selling live and fresh wildlife for food. In addition, in provincial towns that are located close to the sources of wildlife, but may be relatively isolated from markets, here wild meat remains a very important part of the diet. So here we are supporting women and underemployed youth to try to increase the sustainable production of alternative meat products. So poultry, farmed fish, edible insects, as alternatives to eating wildlife. In order to better detect and report zoonotic disease outbreak, the program is using an additional funding we've got from the European Commission to provide case studies and tools and approaches relevant to that practical implementation of the One Health approach that we just heard about, particularly for risk assessment and risk prediction through modeling. Where are the next disease outbreaks likely to happen? Participatory surveillance and capacity building along the whole wild meat value chain and where wildlife and livestock are interacting. The Sustainable Wildlife Management Program is regularly sharing lessons learned and best practices to help also feed the global policy dialogue and to help design measures that can be relevant at international level, perhaps within the frameworks of international conventions or regular sectoral or trans-sectoral bodies, for example, those that FAO has and coordinates, which includes the member states and technical partners, so we can really share that experience. But to conclude, of course, let's not forget that even if we're able to dramatically reduce the likelihood of zoonotic disease outbreaks in the future, and even if we have effective systems in place to detect and report these outbreaks, we will be unable to stop future zoonotic disease pandemics if we don't also have a rapid and effective action to prevent the spread of the disease. So we should not forget the crucial importance on pandemic preparedness of public health agencies. However, this clearly falls beyond the remit of the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, so I would leave that to others to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mette. That was fantastic, and thank you for the summary of the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program that hopefully could be scaled up to other regions of the world. And as we look at prevention of the next pandemic in terms of environmental destruction and that interface between wildlife and people, we also have to look at the whole issue of the consumption of wildlife, particularly by urban residents. We heard from one of the sessions yesterday, someone said, because someone wanted to eat a bat or a rat in Asia, my neighbor is dying in New York. And we have to really look at things in a holistic way globally, but also look at the specific issue of luxury consumption of wild meat. So thank you for bringing that up. Before we go to questions, I'd like to turn to our last panelist, and that's Joe Walston, who's currently Senior Vice President for Global Conservation at the Wildlife Conservation Society, where he's been for more than 20 years. And he's lived and done field work in Southeast Asia, the Congo Basin, and Southern Africa. And the floor is now yours, Joe, please.
Right, thanks very much, Sue. And I intend only to take a few minutes and really just to actually stand on the shoulders of those who have come before, rather than to provide any more of my individual insights. And I've been listening very intently to all the sessions going on both today and yesterday. And I feel it's those sessions which really do feed into the idea of what we can do on a multilateral basis. So I'm really just going to summarize what I think we've heard now, which is, again, the world is facing three existential man-made crises. Those are climate change, those are the biodiversity collapse, and those are the threat of zoonotic pandemics. And I think, you know, what we have now is an understanding of the interrelatedness of those, that we understand now that they are connected, that that degradation and on one of those areas leads to threats to the others, and that the world needs to do both individual responses to those issues. On climate change, we need a specific response to that. But at the heart of it also, we have this new discipline opening up. Because at the heart of that is One Health and this idea of being able to maintain essentially ecological integrity at cities and in grasslands and in forests and coastlands, in order that actually we both reduce the impacts across all three, but also provide the most cost-effective, efficient and equitable response to all three of those crises. A positive response in one is going to result in a positive response across all three. And really that's to me where I'm listening and hearing what One Health really is. It is and I think I go back to, again, the original Harvey Feinberg's response that One Health has got to not be a separate, distinct, standalone sector in and of itself, creating another siloed sector for the 21st century. This has to sit at the heart of the existing sectors in our response. It has to be the connective tissue. It has to be of our environmental, our agricultural, our economic decision makings. And as Carlos Manuel mentions very clearly, you know, we cannot anymore see these as just belonging to one department, one ministry. And as someone who fought in one ministry to to collaborate and cooperate across the others, I think that's a very profound example for us. I think there was something also mentioned today in the Africa session, which was fantastic, which was Michelle Mazera, but also Birgit Pickel from BMZ mentioned the fact that biodiversity conservation can no longer be seen as just a cost or a luxury investment. It has got to be an investment that has returns now. We understand that those biodiversity conservation is actually now a health prerequisite, as well as an economic prerequisite for the global community. So we have the chance now to be able to multilateralism and these multilateral agencies really need to be able to demonstrate leadership now. We need to have bold collective plans that set the stage for countries to be able to adopt individual strategies themselves. Countries are still going to be our main champion within this across the world, but the multilateral facilities need to be able to both encourage, support, and catalyze that action at a national and a local level. I already see and just want to be able to applaud the German government in being able to establish the Legacy Landscapes Fund. I think Chancellor Angela Merkel announced it in a presentation at the UN Biodiversity Summit. Also the BMZ Minister Gerd Müller has announced it as well. And it really is a fantastic initiative at being able to understand the connectivity between biodiversity conservation, climate change, and health. And that is, and so I wanted to recognize the leadership already of the German government and being able to come out and provide examples of how One Health can be implemented. And this is a key. We can talk about it, but how are we actually going to implement it? How are we going to operationalize this? of course, as with any great major global success, it's going to be a combination of carrot and sticks to be able to do that. But at its heart, the multilateral sector now has the opportunity to be able to establish both. The examples by which we can attract greater investment by private industry, by agriculture, by the other sectors. And if we do that, it is not just going to be a slowing of the negative. There is a real opportunity and a real discourse happening at the moment, which points the way towards a reversal of fortune, not just a slowing of decline. But if we do this, there is every ability by harnessing these other sectors. How many decades has the environment sector battled against agriculture, battled against energy, battled against these ministers, whether you're a minister in Costa Rica or you're an NGO or you're a government official, that it's constant battles between that. One Health has the ability to establish an interdisciplinary approach supported by governments and multilaterals to really, for the first time, look at being able to catalyze more than the sum of our parts. That's never happened before, and One Health, by all means, sounds like it's going to be the mechanism. Our job of the next few years is to define how that happens, and the first step is through the multilateral cooperation and being able to establish these facilities and the foundations upon which countries, communities, and civil society can take actions. So thank you to all. I think I'm trying to, again, capture what I have heard coming out of these previous sessions, and especially on the shoulders of those who have spoken before me. So thank you, Sue, back to you.
Thank you, Joe. Fantastic, excellent remarks and summary. And one important point that I heard you talking about is sort of, we hear governments saying, well, we want to do more about biodiversity, but please send us more money. And this isn't about just sending more money, it's about working differently. And Mr. Pailler mentioned the support of the government of France for eliminating the harmful subsidies. There is far more money going into harming the environment, harming biodiversity, and therefore harming our health than we will ever need to protect the intact systems that we have. So we really need to look at the funds and the investments that are going into creating harm and creating the biodiversity and climate change crises we're experiencing. I have a couple of questions from the audience, but happy to hear from participants on other points. And one thing we see a lot is these various silos. Governments say, well, I do biodiversity. Well, no, I do health. And everyone will say, well, we all do One Health now, but they actually really aren't doing One Health. They're just adding a label. I like to think of it as it's not a zero-sum game. It's not, can we alleviate poverty or can we protect biodiversity? We have to have a win-win solution. So what do you see as the means to break down those silos? What needs to happen now? Not in 10 years. What needs to happen now to truly bring together all of these different sectors? And I open that up if any one of you would like to speak. Carlos, Manuel?
Yes, please. Well, you all brought a couple of very, very important topics. We need to avoid the north-south confrontations. Who's going to pay for the 1.5? Who's going to pay for the 30%? Because we all now understand that it's on the very self-interest of our own people and our countries to mobilize resources from all sources in a more efficient manner. And we can double and triple the flow of resources from the north to the south, that won't make any difference in terms of the size of the problem that we have. So it's a mixture of two things. Yes, we need to increase funding from the north to the south, particularly in those least developed countries, not necessarily in those OECD middle income nations, because they do have money. And I talk, based on my experience in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has been walking alone, financially speaking, from the multilateral perspective for 30 years. That has forced us to be more more policy coherence. We've been phasing out perverse incentives and subsidies that generate harm to biodiversity. And at the same time, we were forced by that situation to generate non-fiscal innovative financial mechanisms, the conservation trust funds. The tax on fossil fuels. We put a tax on fossil fuels in 1997 that today generates $32 million that is totally investing in payments to owners of forests and agroforestry systems for the carbon offsetting services they provide to us. So that can be done in many, many other countries. So two things are extremely important here, Susan, that countries need to do. One is, they say we need more money. Well, first, do your local homework. First, identify how much money are you investing in biodiversity conservation. You need to do your biodiversity expenditures review. When you do that, you'll come to realize that you're probably investing 2 or 3 times more money than what you previously think or thought. We normally say a government is investing X amount of money just by looking to the budget of the Ministry of Environment, and that is just one piece of the analysis. The Ministry of Agriculture and other ministries invest a lot in areas that are important and relevant. And the other is, as you do the expenditure review, your biodiversity expenditure review, you need to be able to do the gap analysis. As you do the gap, your financial needs, when you do your financial needs, you got the gap analysis here where the multilateral agencies can come in and support you narrowing that gap in a way that the country can achieve their national and international commitments. Thank you.
Thank you. And sorry, I left for a moment because my Wi-Fi disappeared. Anyone else want to step in on this point? Mr. Pailler, please.
Thank you very much, Susan. In my views, in fact, we need to be concrete and pragmatic. I should say no more speech, and we have to act and react. This is the most important thing. And we need to, to start from the existing platforms. I can only talk about some examples from my countries, for instance. We have created at the national level an epidemiological surveillance platform, which is quite interesting to analyze. It's called the ESA, a National Animal Health Epidemiological Surveillance Platform. And this platform brings together public and private actors. So, for instance, we've got some organization like the French Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health and Safety. We've got the CIRAD, and so some research centers. And this ESA platform monitors around 20 health hazards in farms and wildlife in France. So it's quite important. To give you an example, since 2013, the ESA system has therefore not only made it possible to improve the detection of epizootics at borders, but also to enforce and coordinate surveillance and protection systems on the national metropolitan territory and in the overseas departments and territories. Moreover, in parallel to that national system, we've got some other example of international cooperation. For instance, the CIRAD has created some regional networks based on the One Health concept that are defined. For example, the Carib Vet network, which is run from Guadeloupe, brings together research organizations or universities, veterinary service directorates from 33 countries and territories, as well as regional and international organizations. So this, the various actions coordinated by this Carib Vet has worked on avian influenza, for instance. And so it works on the early warning and the reinforcement of the border vigilance in particular, and it made it possible to prevent the disease in 2016 into the Caribbean. So that I would like just to tell you is that from examples existing, especially regarding these platforms of exchange between actors, and it's quite important to start from these examples and be concrete and pragmatic. Thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to intervene on that, or I have another question? Mette, Ms. Wilkie, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And it won't be surprising to you what I want to talk to you about. I think what we certainly need to do is to find ways to better protect, manage, and restore our natural resources and ecosystems. We know that much of what is happening at the moment, the diseases and the outbreaks that are happening are due to the degradation of our ecosystems, in particularly our forests. So one of the things we need to do is to transform our food systems. We need to look at how we can actually produce the food that's needed by an increasing population by 2050 without harming the environment and the natural resources. This means we have to look at sustainable intensification of agriculture. We have to reduce food loss and waste. We have to make sure that we promote the healthy diets from sustainable food systems. We promote approaches such as agroecology, agroforestry, and importantly, that we restore the productivity of degraded land so that we can continue to produce food without expanding into forests and other natural ecosystems. Secondly, we need to manage the resources that we have, and that requires that we find solutions that have positive outcomes for both biodiversity and community needs. So it does have to be in a very, very participatory process that we do that at the local level. And the third one is that we do need to restore the damage that we have already done. We need to actively engage in restoration of degraded ecosystems across the globe. I think we have seen some examples of how that can be done. I want to go back to the example I mentioned earlier with the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, which really is combining the conservation of biodiversity and the making sure that communities have the livelihoods and the food security. It may seem odd that you can do both at the same time, but you can with the efforts that we are putting into place here by reducing the demand for wild meat from outside the community, by trying to have other livelihood opportunities for the rural people. But also, of course, to see that we make sure that we don't have overexploitation. So we need to know more about the availability of the hunted wildlife and the hunting pressure. So to use surveys, camera traps, interviews to get that information so that we can help design or revise the hunting regulations to ensure that wildlife resources are sustainably managed. And then lastly, again, that issue of the restoration. We can increase the supply by supporting the restoration of habitats. So very practical example of how we combine food security, conservation of biodiversity, prevent zoonotic diseases from re-emerging, and deal also with aspects related to climate change and local livelihoods.
Thank you. Thank you. That's fantastic. I have a comment. Joe, you wanted to make a comment, then I'll ask one final question. Go ahead, please.
Just a very different point, but we should also remember how bad and difficult it has been on both the fronts of science and multilateralism in the last few years. And and I think it is worth. This is a session about multilateralism, and I think we are hopefully entering into a possible new phase and a brighter phase. I think there's a responsibility on all our shoulders to put back science and at the heart of multilateralism as well. Is that we often form collaborations internationally for a variety of reasons, sometimes pure self-interest, sometimes for economic gain. And I think there's an opportunity here for One Health cannot succeed without multilateralism. And I believe that multilateralism One Health cannot work without the scientific underpinnings. So I think science offers us a more of an objective basis upon which to form this. Of course, countries will remain self-interested to a reasonable amount, but I would hope, and many of you on this, the other speakers are far more qualified than myself on this subject, but I would hope that we are entering into a new phase whereby there is an interest in multilateralism that goes beyond that and is looking to the science to be able to guide how One Health can have the greatest impacts on economies, on the most vulnerable communities, on food, and agricultural systems, as well as biodiversity and climate change. So I would just like to end with making a call for keeping science and multilateralism at the heart of this.
Yes, thank you. And I would concur, of course, and bring in a point raised by one of our speakers in the Latin America session yesterday, looking forward to a renewed support for the role of science in policymaking in the United States, and hoping to see, we don't want spillover of pathogens, but we do want spillover of the use of science. So we're hoping to see that, and I'm trying to be very optimistic about that. I have one last question very quickly. We've had so many excellent questions from the participants in the chat, and I can't ask them all, but many are asking about which multilateral forum are you talking about? And of course, there are many, but I would ask participants, if you like, what's the one thing in terms of multilateral action, the one forum that will make the greatest difference quickly? Several people have suggested, do we need a new global One Health agency? Should we go to the UN, which is the umbrella for many UN agencies? But what's the one thing, we need to do everything, but what's the one thing we need to do quickly? Because we can't say, we'll get to that in a few years. So if you can address that before we have to close, I appreciate it. Who would like to go first?
Can I
Carlos
go?
Manuel, please.
Thank you. You know, the multilateral system, how we have structured it is not that different on how we have structured our governments. And we need to understand at the government level, and talking about the public sector framework infrastructure, I tend to strongly believe that we won't be able to do the leap forward in terms of our aspiration for sustainability with the same institutional framework that in first place created the problem that we want to solve today. That means that we need to do, that means that the institutional framework should should aim for a landscape approach and should aim for sustainability and stop working on silos and sector. I think that the multilateral system also needs to do that. I don't believe that the way we have structured the UN system, which has been, saying for, decades and decades, is properly suitable for the many challenges that we have. So we need to revisit that. And there's been some very interesting proposals of, a grandmother convention, grandmother agency. We won't be able to do the leap forward with the same institutional framework at the multilateral or national level that in first place has proven ineffective in terms of scales to solve the problem. So I'm very open for adjustments and really thinking out of the box, because we just have 1 decade in front of us to really move the oil tanker into the right direction.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that before we wrap up? Mr. Pailler, and then Ms. Wilkie, please.
Thank you, Susan. So regarding France, so we have proposed, for responding to your question, with our German colleagues, the creation of the One Health high-level expert council. And so this objective of this council is to address risks at the human-animal environment interface. This is the objective which is behind this council. And the council will, in fact, collect, distribute, publicize valuable scientific information on the links between human, animal, and environmental health in order to support the public officials and to make the appropriate decision. This is one important aspect of this council. The other thing that I would like just to add regarding your question, I think it's really essential to focus the political attention on this specific linkage between the human and animal environmental health and interface. It's really important. And I would just like to underline and to mention the Leaders Pledge for Nature, which was launched during the last ENGA in New York. And it's really important to see the involvement of the leaders on this aspect and the integration of One Health approach. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you for your.
Thank you. And Ms. Wilkie, please, before we wrap up.
Sure, and I'm of course from specialized agencies, so I very much wanted to say follow up what Joe was talking about. We have to make sure that we don't lose the evidence base and the specific knowledge that is existing in the very specialized, if you will, agencies and organizations within the UN. So if you wanted to create a new structure, you run the risk of trying to create something that either becomes very big because it has to deal with all the aspects, and at the same time, perhaps lose some of that technical expertise for specific aspects of it. I think what we have here, we have a structure that may not be ideal, but we have all the expertise on all the different aspects that need to come together. So the fact that we do start working together in a One Health approach, that we have an organization structure that helps us also have an environmental management group under the UN, that we have a Secretary General who's willing to take the lead and bring all the agencies and organizations together to make sure that we have a UN systematic or system-wide approach to aspects, I think is something that we shouldn't forget, and that's something that we can certainly build on going forward as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time, though I really appreciate the input from the panelists here. I think we could talk about this issue for a couple hours longer, and we won't. But together we will work to take biodiversity into the Premier League. But also we've heard we cannot continue with business as usual, either at the national level or the multilateral level. Business as usual is why we're all sitting at home as we have this very rich conversation. It's why the globe and millions of people are suffering health and financial and livelihood losses from this pandemic. So we have to work together to change what we do in terms of biodiversity, health, infrastructure. What do we mean by sustainability, and how do we move forward in terms of the use of wildlife and commercialization of natural resources? I would like to thank all of the panelists here, first of all, for their very rich contributions. Thank you, the participants, for joining us, for your questions in the chat. We will be making the videotape available, and thank you again to the German Federal Foreign Office for the tremendous support to make this possible. And we will try to write up these very rich conversations and conclusions to move forward and hopefully galvanize governments to take action nationally and multilaterally. Thank you very much to all of you on behalf of the Wildlife Conservation Society and all my colleagues at WCS for joining us today and yesterday in this important conference. Let's move forward to prevent the next pandemic. Thank you very much.